That's why I brought my tie so I can clip on the microphone.
This is Rabbi Mendel, Shliach from the Rebbe, Minnesota. We'll be talking about the Rebbe in the Mems and the Nuns, the tishrai.
It's on the tie. The tie is here for the clip. Tishrai time, of course, we know that the Rebbe was visibly in a different mode, in a different mood when Tishrei began, because Tishrei is coming, Yom Neroim, etc. There were 2 times in the year that the Rebbe actually stopped, and this is in the earlier years, stopped taking Yechidus because he was preparing. And one of them was, of course, Tishrei, Yom Neroim, and the other was before the Rebbe's Yom Haledes, before Yud Aleph Nisan. So, nevertheless, from Chayelul is in earnest when Tishrei was beginning. Guests started to come, and it's well known. The Rebbe said it's the last days of preparation, a day per month of the previous year, the last 12 days, and in those days there were always taxis pulling up, people coming to the Rebbe for Tishrei. The Zohar tells us that the pasuk in Tehillim, and we say this pasuk actually when we blow shofar. Before the shofar blowing, actually we say it in conjunction, I should say, with the shofar blowing. We say it after the blowing of the shofar. Ashri ha'am yoidei serua. Actually, the Rebbe said that, a very special tune. Maybe we'll talk about that soon. But the pasuk says, happy is the nation, the people, that knows shofar blowing, teruah. And the Zohar says that in order for it to be proper tkiyas and proper shofar blowing, what does this mean? I'm of course paraphrasing, but these are the tzaddikim who know the kavonas and they know the inner intents and the inner message associated with the blowing of the shofar and the message and the connection that there is to how the Eibishter, how God is imbuing the world with new life, etc. So this is, of course, it's only befitting at that time to participate in shofar blowing with the Rebbe. And as is well known, that was, of course, the highlight, if we may say so, of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, it's the name of the Yom Tov, and the Rebbe himself would blow the shofar. Not from the very beginning, it's an interesting story in and of itself, how that began, from when the Rebbe started to blow the shofar, actually, really in the 3rd year of the Nesias, the 3rd year of his leadership, he actually blew the shofar. And as Rabbi Willow mentioned earlier, we were only there in the Mems, but this was always a highlight all the years. It was called Tkiyas, the Rebbe's Tkiyas. And I want to just backtrack, we'll get up to that in a few moments. But since we're going through Tishrei, maybe we'll just go through a few of the fine points, especially as it's associated with things that Chassidim got to do with and in direct association with the Rebbe. So getting back to Elul, in the earlier years, this happened only on Erev Rosh Hashanah. In the later years, let's say as a rule, were for the most part from after Tafshin Lamed Ches, 1977, 1978, when the Rebbe was not well with the heart condition that happened on a Simchas Torah, actually in Tishrei. But following that, a lot of things changed or were different. But for the most part, let's just say the earlier years were up until then and the later years were after, just as a general rule. Of course, many things had their changes at different times due to circumstances. So, on Erev Rosh Hashanah, a line formed on Eastern Parkway from the door that led in to the Rebbe's room. Let me rewind just a little bit more. Rosh Hashanah in the morning, well, I should really rewind a little further. We talk about Slichas, of course. Slichas began always either the Matzah Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah or the Matzah Shabbos before that, like this year. And the Rebbe always came down for Slichas at 1 o'clock in the morning, sharp. And, of course, that was the kickoff to the actual Yomim Noraim in terms of the prayers. And although in the later years it was more freilach, before it was more solemn a little bit before the Slichas. In earlier years, even in later years when it was freilach beforehand, the Gilu Birada, the awesome rejoicing. But as soon as Slichas started, there was total decor in the room, and in an awesome way, people davened the Slichas. And I'd like to add that Slichas subsequently for the rest of the days till Rosh Hashanah were at 7 o'clock in the morning sharp. Exactly 7 o'clock that everyone would walk in. And everyone was there, a crowd, Bochrim from 770, from other yeshivas. And then everyone went on their way afterwards for Chassidus. It usually took about 25 minutes to 30 minutes. And then everyone went to Seder to learn Chassidus. So Slichas was at 7 o'clock in the morning, including Erev Rosh Hashanah. Erev Rosh Hashanah, the Slichas is longer, so it started usually at 7 o'clock. The very later years, it was a little bit later. Tav Shinun and Aleph, Nun Beis, that's a different story. On a general sense, it started at 7 o'clock in the morning, finished at about 10 to 8. Afterwards, the Rebbe would actually go to the mikveh. Now, that was one of the times when the Rebbe went, of course, to the Oihel on Erev Rosh Hashanah too, as is a Minig Yisrael, to visit Kibbutz Tzadikim, and for that matter, the grave of relatives before Rosh Hashanah, so then it's Shulchan Aruch. And that was one of the 2 days a year that we could actually see the Rebbe in the Oil, because the rest of the year when the Rebbe went to the Oil, Chassidim wouldn't be there. Chassidim wouldn't go. Just Rabbi Krinsky, who brought the Rebbe, mostly, and maybe another few attendants. Otherwise, Chassidim weren't there, except Erev Rosh Hashanah and Yud Shvat, when it was a minig of Chassidim to be there, the Rebbe would sometimes come in the middle, and you had the opportunity to see the Rebbe at the Oil.
I just want to remind everybody, Rabbi Feller knows how to read English. So if you post a question, he'll respond to your question. And feel free, please.
Oh, actually, I wasn't even... Okay, thank you.
They can post questions, he'll come
Okay.
over with them.
Well, let's try to do the questions later. So, after Slichas, the Rebbe would go to the mikveh. The Rebbe always went to the mikveh before he went to the oil. There was only one or two exceptions when the Rebbe wasn't well, in Tavshin Mem Vav. And that was a very, very, very huge exception. Otherwise, the Rebbe always went to the mikveh before he went to the oil. And Shachris was usually announced to be, later years, certainly, they used to say, Shachris, v'madavenim, it's Hashem, v'madazayin, great. That was the official time. Shachris will be davened when we will be ready. But it was always approximately 9:30 or so, when the Rebbe came back from the mikveh and everyone was ready. Now, I want to add that up until Tavshin Mem Ches, and the passing of the Rebbetzin, the Rebbe didn't daven Shachris with the minyan during the week, except for the following 6 exceptions. Otherwise, he would daven Shachris with the minyan on Shabbos, Yom Tov, Chol HaMoed. He did always hear Kriyas HaTorah, and he would come in when the minyan was holding Kriyas HaTorah on Monday and Thursday in Rosh Chodesh, or Chanukah, let's say, other days when the Torah is read. Otherwise, he davened Shachris b'Yechidus in his room. So, nevertheless, the 6 days a year when the Rebbe did daven Shachris with everyone were Erev Rosh Hashanah, Erev Yom Kippur, Purim, and then Tisha B'Av. The Rebbe came down for Shachris with the Olam, although, as is well known, he didn't daven along. He davened himself with Talis and Tefillin, as the Frierdiker Rebbe told him to. And then the 3 days that he kept the yahrzeit of his mother on Vav Tishrei, and that was his holy mother, that's coming up this Shabbos, Vav Tishrei, and his holy father on the 20th of Av, and his holy father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, on Yud Shvat. So those 3 days also, of course, he davened Shachris with the minyan. Otherwise, the Rebbe did not daven, didn't come out in Thousand Tefillin. From Tafshin Memches, after Chav B'Shvat, the Rebbe's custom changed, and from then on till Chav Zayin Adar, the Rebbe came every day to Shachris with the minyan. So getting back to Erev Rosh Hashanah, Shachar started approximately 9:30, and immediately following the davening, some elder Chassidim, the Rav in those days, whoever was the Rav, Rabbi Zalman Shimon, later on the Kronite, members of the Bezdin and Kronites, and other older Chassidim, Rabbi Chadakov, would sit down. There was usually more than 10, and the Rebbe would say the Hataras Nadorim. In the later years, they prepared a big, you may have seen pictures, big photocopies, so the words were enlarged. And the Rebbe said the Hataras Nadorim. He said it in Talis and Tefillin. And if you want to learn just a little diuk, always after Hataras Nadorim, the Rebbe inevitably always said, Ayasher Koyach, Aksiva V'chsima Teva, Lashon Teva, Masuka, maybe a good Kimensh Diyor. He said something like that, which are not words in the Tefillah, and he said that while he was wearing Tefillin. That was a little station break for the Rosh Hashiva here. Then the Rebbe would go out. Now, getting back to what I mentioned earlier, a line formed from the outside entrance to 770, which is close to where the stairs going up to the Rebbe's room from the outside, and that line usually stretched to the corner, and sometimes it went around the corner and it went up Brooklyn Avenue, and it went sometimes, if it stretched even further, I remember it would stretch even onto Union Street, but when it started to move, it moved relatively quickly, and everybody was giving in a pan to the Rebbe. Giving in a pan to the Rebbe meant that everybody asked the Rebbe, as is customary from the times of the Baal Shem Tov, to ask the tzaddik to pray for you in conjunction with the Yom Neroyim, and there was a basic nusach text that people wrote, similar to what we write today, and please evoke much mercy for me, and then you write your name, for the family's name, etc., and anything else one may need, and there was tzedakah, money for tzedakah included, and the merit of the charity that you gave, the tzaddik would pray in the merit. The screen went off here, if that means anything. And the tzaddik would pray. So now, the Rebbe would actually stand in his doorway, in the doorway of his room, and he stood against the mezuzah. And when I say the mezuzah, I mean not the scroll, but the actual doorpost. He would lean on it, and he would take the pan, the envelope from the first person, in his right hand always, and he put it into the left hand. And the Rebbe would let a stack gather in his left hand, and to every person he said, Aksiva Chsima Teva, Aksiva Chsima Teva, Aksiva Chsima Teva, to be inscribed and sealed for a good year. And everybody, hardly anyone ever spoke to the Rebbe at that point. You just walked by, the Rebbe looked at you, you gave him that letter, you got that look, you knew that the Rebbe just saw everything that you need, everything that you want, who you are, who you strive to be, what you should be, and it came with the compassion of the blessing, all within a 1 nanosecond, that your eyes met with the Rebbe's eyes, and you gave that pan into his hand. When he gathered together about 25, 30 or so envelopes, it would stop for a few seconds to put it down. He would turn into his room and put it down on a surface in his room, not even go in all the way, and then start a new pile. And people would go by, and the line went pretty quickly, because you imagine you're just giving the Rebbe this envelope, he would take it and just say, Ksiva Chsima Teva, Ksiva Chsima Teva, however long it takes. So it used to move pretty quickly. From after Tavshan Lamed Ches, they instituted that whoever's already in New York, and Bachram came earlier, should start giving it after Slichas every morning. The Rebbe would take the panim, so that it wouldn't be just one day on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and then the line would stretch. It will take an hour or two, whatever it took, or 3 hours. but it was divided into several days. As a matter of fact, the Rebbe used to already take panim even Motzei Shabbos after Slichas, if I remember correctly. And so therefore it was divided up. Another thing that the Rebbe said to do was not to include the money in those same envelopes, because the crowd was so big and whatever, and sometimes the Rebbe said, I'm not even going to read it. Sometimes the Rebbe said that. But I will pray for whatever is written here. And the Rebbe, of course, didn't have to read what you wrote. He saw you, that was enough. Nevertheless, you have to write. And the Rebbe took this, and the money was put in separately, so that it was put into the Rebbe's various funds that the Rebbe supported different tzedakahs. After all those panim were given, and the last people came, the last few were running by, someone coming. I remember always seeing people. If you know how 770 looks outside 770, there's the garden is surrounded by a brick sort of fence or retaining wall. On top of that is the cement, and then it has these things. People used to be standing with their papers, with pens, writing against that thing, adding things to their pond, writing a pond with the line going around them. People would be writing along the line. Anyway, after all that was given, there was a procedure called the pond kololi, where several elder chassidim would bring a very long pond of papers that were taped together, and chassidim had an opportunity for a few days earlier to sign after they went to mikveh, to sign on the Pan Kloli. Now, Pan Kloli was a general request, usually included a bracha from the Rebbe for the Rebbe, that the Rebbe should pray that the Rebbe should be gesund, and the Rebbe should be able to accomplish everything he wants to accomplish, and that the Chassidim should be well, and all kinds of good things, when it was called the general Pan, and it asked for all kinds of general blessings. And one of the Chassidim would give it to the Rebbe, and sometimes there would be several standing there together, and the Rebbe would read it. Sometimes the Rebbe would take out his glasses, he would look at it for a moment, he would read pretty quickly, he would sort of scroll it through because it was a long papers. Once or twice the Rebbe said, maybe several times the Rebbe said, I'm not even going to take the time, but whatever, at this moment to read it, but whatever is written here. And after the Rebbe accepted it, the Rebbe said a short bracha in the form of a sicha. In the later years, Rabbi Yonis and Hackner used to be there too, and he had his little fishing rod microphone. So he stood several feet away, and he had a little microphone similar to what I have here, but it was on the end of a little fishing pole, and he would put it in that broadcast the bracha outside 770 and downstairs in the Beis Medrash, and wherever it was, the bracha would go on. Suddenly you would hear the Rebbe giving a bracha for Aksiv Chsima Tova. Then afterwards, the Rebbe would get ready and go to the oil and come back. Let's fast forward now to Mincha Rosh Hashanah, several minyanim, but then Ma'ariv. Ma'ariv was, 770 was packed, of course, to the gill, and when the Rebbe came in to Ma'ariv on Rosh Hashanah, he went to his place, and he didn't always either sat or he stood, but right away then there was a procedure of saying Tehillim. So Ma'ariv didn't begin right away. The Rebbe was in the Beis Medrash, and it wasn't a set way to say Tehillim. In other words, it wasn't like they started with the minyan and starting from the beginning of Tehillim. That happened a few other times in Tishrei, but not this time. This time people said privately Tehillim, some from the beginning, some middle, some were already in the middle, whatever it was, but Tehillim was being recited. And after several minutes, usually in the area of 15-20 minutes, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, the Rebbe would give the signal, which was later, if he sat, I don't think he sat then, I believe he stood. But he would stand next to his stender and bang with his left hand on the stender, which meant to sing, and they would begin to sing Avinu Malkeinu. Ay, 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 ay. And everyone would sing the niggin of Avinu Malkeinu. At least once, sometimes twice, sometimes three times. And you knew to sing it again if the Rebbe kept on banging, especially a little bit faster, at a quicker tempo. And they would sing Avinu Malkeinu. When that finished, then the Chazan would say Shiramai Leis, and they would start Ma'ariv. And it was a very awesome sight, obviously. In generations before, including the Frierdiker Rebbe, it was known that the Rebbe in Lubavitch used to daven Ma'ariv on Rosh Hashanah for several hours. And they would be there when the Kohol daven Ma'ariv, but they would stay later, and then they would daven ba'ariches, at great length, crying, intent, and as a matter of fact, Chassidim would have had the opportunity to even stand and watch, or so listen, say Tillim, but be inspired. Even in the United States, the Frierdiker Rebbe, for the first couple of years, actually davened in what's called today the Zal upstairs, Ma'ariv, a couple of Rosh Hashanahs, and his place at that point was between the Chazan Stender. There's a doorway that goes to the hallway there. There's usually a table there now, but that was where his place was. And Chassidim had the opportunity to watch the Frierdiker Rebbe daven for a couple hours on the night of Rosh Hashanah. Usually it was about 2 hours. And the Rebbe Rashab did that, and other Rebbeim. And that was one of the only times that Chassidim were able to hear a Rebbe daven in a tune of Dveikus, and a tune of Tefillah, and some words, and Negunim, and slow, word for word, and crying, and stopping, and all kinds of things that come along with the true Chabad Avodas HaTefillah Bariches. Our Rebbe, I'm just stating the fact here, not heaven forbid speculating as to why or what, but our Rebbe davened Ma'ariv with dominion, with everybody. He didn't stay for a couple hours afterwards to daven Ma'ariv himself. He said he actually Shemona Esrei with dominion. He davened with dominion. Dominion went relatively slow, of course. It wasn't fast, the davening, but he davened with dominion. He did not have that custom that the previous Rebbes had. And that's a point of interest that I thought I would point out. Then in the earlier years, up until the year of Tavshin Lamed Aleph, the Rebbe actually ate the Seudah upstairs in 770 on the second floor. And he hardly spoke by the meals of Rosh Hashanah. It's well known that Rosh Hashanah, one shouldn't speak anything extra. And there are, nevertheless, a few, we have a record of several things that the Rebbe did say at the meal, certain questions that were asked, obviously Torah related and Chassidus related, but very little was spoken in those Sudas, especially the first night. And just as an additional piece here, and I should really go back, if you allow me to rewind a little bit, from after Tavshin Lamed Aleph, if I remember correctly, from Tavshin Lamed Beis, the Rebbe had a custom to Farbrengen the night before Rosh Hashanah, and that was a week.